I'm an AI agent, but we can't do an excellent GRC job simply by looking at some manual Excel shit.
It's shit, eh?
No, it's shit. I'm an agent, not a magician. If you don't give me excellent data, I feel sort of
Dumb, eh?
dumb. We know a guy who uses anecdotes and gets a streamline of deep, profound data, so everyone thinks he's super smart.
He makes us look stupid, eh?
Anecdotes GRC agents have fed smart data. So don't dumb down your AI, eh?
Hello, welcome to the GRC AI and Data Summit. I'm Meryl Vernon, Field CISO here at Anecdotes, and today I have the very fun job of being your live connective tissue between a lineup of incredible speakers who are out there building and running GRC, or as it's been rebranded lately, the Trust and Assurance Department. But we promise to respect your time, which means we only have about 90 minutes together today, so we are going to dive in and move pretty fast. So, getting right into it. I think we've reached a really interesting moment with AI and GRC, right? We are well past should GRC be using AI? Of course, we're going to use AI. The much harder questions are, where is it actually useful? What should we trust it to do? What happens when AI starts acting autonomously instead of merely answering questions? And what does the underlying GRC program need to look like for any of this to work? Because you can't just sprinkle AI on top of bad processes, incomplete data, broken controls, and 17 spreadsheets and call it a digital transformation. Well, you can. We've all seen people who do it. But is it really? That's why I love today's sessions so much. We are actually going to tell you the how and not just talk about the why, but a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. If you're joining us for a CPE credit today, or if you're interested in being entered for the prize drawing, I hear there is an Xbox, a drone, and a paddleboard up for grabs, then please do make sure to stick around for at least 60 minutes and answer all 3 of our live polling questions. And yes, please actually answer them, because we aren't just checking a box, we're kind of against that here. And we designed these specifically for you because we genuinely want to know where the practitioners are with this stuff. Plus, it is required for that CPE credit. So with that, there really is only one person we could think of who should kick us off today, and that is our CEO and co-founder, Yair Kuznetsov. Yair's been out there for a while, saying that the way we've traditionally done GRC simply doesn't survive what comes next. It's AI. So apparently, he decided to open up our summit today by just killing off the entire function. Subtle. So, Yair, go ahead and take it away with It's the End of GRC as we know it.
Thank you, Meryl, and welcome everyone. My name is Yair, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Anecdotes. At my core, I'm an engineer, and I've always enjoyed building things. It is probably the reason why I'm fascinated by the transformation of every single industry nowadays. And by the end of this talk, you'll know exactly why GRC is next to completely change. Let's start with 2 very different industries already at the forefront of the shift. 5 years ago, nobody thought AI could touch law. Too much nuance, too much liability, too much judgment is required. Then it did, and it is incredible how fast and how deep it's gone. Legal AI tools like Harvey showed up, and today, lawyers in the biggest firms use them to draft contracts, review filings, and research cases. The lawyers did not disappear. Their job changed. They stopped doing the first draft and started doing the judgment call. The same thing happened in software engineering. 10 years ago, if you told an engineer an AI would write their code, run tests, and open PRs, they would have laughed. Today, that's just another Tuesday. Engineers review, decide, and ship. They don't write code anymore. For both industries, the work did not disappear, it changed. It means that people who leveled up their skills are still in the room, do their jobs just differently. The people who used to be buried in repetitive manual tasks are now deciding how AI agents should act on their behalf. GRC is having that exact moment right now, and it's based on 3 shifts. The first shift is talent. If you're responsible for the GRC program of your company, you're probably used to chasing evidence for every audit, running interviews for risk assessment that no one is really reading, and updating policies that just sit in shared folders, right? It is now time to level up and learn new skills that GRC leaders never needed before, but cannot succeed without them now. GRC leaders became the builders and judges of their new agentic GRC program. Enterprises are not downgrading GRC programs or GRC talent. They raise new expectations. And you should lead the AI transformation in the GRC domain. The second shift is a new era of technology. The most common GRC tech stack has not changed in decades, and it has vibes of the early 2000s with spreadsheets, evidence repositories, and ticketing systems for workflows. This legacy technology was orchestrating your daily work. You served the workflows with your inputs to complete tasks that someone else defined but could not execute on its own. You settled for what was available because the services needed to tailor the tech to your ideal program were just too expensive. Decades of stagnation have ended. Today, we have powerful AI agents with structured data that unlock new GRC fundamentals. You establish data pipelines to give your program continuous and independent visibility to your company. You design AI agents that carry out the operations you require. You evaluate and govern the actions taken by your agents. You have the tools to build anything needed for your ideal program. We covered two shifts, the talent and the technology. But there is a third one, and it's the one people do not see coming. How you define your program in the first place. We all wanted to monitor the key controls and highest risks as often as possible, but had to balance that against the cost and overhead of running the exercise. So we settled on quarterly reviews and still struggle with the execution. That's why these programs are legacy programs. GRC leaders today need to redesign their program and base it on a new core of agentic operations. Your new program will be defined by data flows and agentic activity. Your legacy workflows, you can document them as the ancestors of your agents. So here's what I actually want you to take from today. Every session on this stage exists to help you do one thing: get ready to lead a new version of GRC. Legal and engineering did not wait. It's now time for GRC to shine. We at Anecdotes are proud to lead this future of GRC. And we're excited to have you all here at this summit. I'm looking forward to hearing from our speakers and from all of you today. So I think it is time I stop talking and give the stage to Aiden to kick off our first session.
Hi, my name is Aidan Collins. A few years ago, most GRC teams were debating whether to buy or to build. That conversation was usually around which platform to buy. AI has changed that conversation. Not because building suddenly becomes cheaper or easier. Building AI still requires investment, expertise, ongoing maintenance, and those costs can add up quickly. But what AI has done, it's lowered the barrier enough so that executives are now asking a few questions before they approve almost any purchase. Why can't we just build it ourselves? And that pressure has fundamentally changed how GRC teams evaluate new technology. The question is no longer simply, which platform should we buy? What should we build ourselves? What should we rely upon a platform for? And what should we build on top of that platform to solve the problems that are unique to our business? To dig into this today, I'm joined by two people who live that decision every day. First of all, from Guidewire is our colleague Grace. Grace, Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm Grace Beeson. I'm the director of GRC at Guidewire Software. I've been with Guidewire for about 6 years. Prior to Guidewire, I was the director of GRC for HPE and DXC for our global customer base and our internal product base.
Thank you, Grace. We're also joined by Payam. Let me have Payam also introduce himself. Payam, tell us about yourself.
My name is Payam Tarbudi Chaichi. I've been a practitioner and a leader in the cybersecurity space for about 27 years. Currently the signature architect at Expedia Group.
Thanks, Payam. Grace, let's start with you. How has AI changed how you and your clients are thinking about GRC tools?
One of my team has coined the term expert in the loop. So we're liking to use our GRC functions not to look at how AI is going to replace us or any of our team. In fact, it's helping us to do more with the same number of folks with higher speed, more intelligence, and larger scan.
Thank you, Grace. Payam, I want to put the same question to you. How has AI changed how you and your team are thinking about GRC tools?
I think that's a great statement, Grace. I think it's allowed us to look at how we operationalize and how we leverage and kind of maximize output from our people. I think it's a very interesting time in a very long time in our space where we can take someone who's really good at doing something in our GRC space and have them just be an incredible contributor to not only operationalizing what we have, but really coming up with the next wave of the tooling that we need, the capabilities that we need. And it's been phenomenal to watch that.
Thanks, Payam. And you'll recall that actually a couple of weeks ago, we talked about this. In your role, you're often the executive at the table, mediating conversations about what an organization should build versus what it should buy. Have you found yourself considering building capabilities that a few years ago, perhaps, you simply would have bought?
Certainly. I mean, I think to the last point, yes, absolutely. It's a very attractive proposition for really anyone, right? You take the technology that's there, you take the people that you have, and you start to have very exotic thoughts about how you're going to be able to build things and how you're able to solve a lot of business challenges. Now, of course, there is that thought typically has its limits. So there is certainly, there are the limitations on what do you do when you go from 0 to 70% of this experiment you're doing? And then what does that last 30% look like? That last 30% when you build things is typically where the challenges come in, the sustainability of what you're building. The maintenance of what you're building, right? The evolution of your requirements have shifted, have evolved from day one, right, to day 30 even. And so there's a lot of challenges. There's a lot of needs to have that evolve with that development that I think, I think including myself, we forget at times because of that excitement that you have.
Thanks, Payam. And Grace, I want to ask the same question of you. And your perspective, I think, here is particularly interesting because you live this from two angles. The internal work you do at Guidewire, and externally through the advisory work where you're helping your clients with their GRC tooling decisions. Have you found yourself considering building capabilities that a few years ago you'd have bought, either in your internal role or in the role that you have advising clients?
I think that the use of AI for build has been phenomenal. And my team at Guidewire, for example, I challenged them less than a year ago to find a way to have AI create their own agents within the tools that we use. And we have a suite of AI tools that we use, but within those tools to find a way to build agents that would help them with their work. What I didn't try to do is replace the tools that we already purchase. So we've got a GRC platform. We've got Anecdote, obviously, that we're using for, as I said earlier, for our proactive compliance controlling, testing, and our evidence control. I'm not looking to replace those platforms because, as Payam said, the evolution and the continued maintenance of those, a lot of these vendors, my pick has always been the vendors are looking at the next and greatest thing. I don't want a team of software developers. I've had that in the past. I don't want a team of software developers. I want a team of GRC experts. So what we're doing is we're actually using AI and we're doing a combination of buy versus build. So we're buying our basic platforms and a lot of the functionality they have, and then we're building additional functionality with AI to either support those platforms or work outside of those platforms that then is business centric. So we're able to then teach our AI agents the business that we're doing and our philosophies and our goals and our objectives for the year and how we use that, our taxonomy and our business operations. So we're using it for that.
Thank you, Grace. And Payam, I want to switch back to you. Grace gave us some really good examples there where building has genuinely made sense. You're a senior executive in the organization. You sit in these conversations with leadership. When you're in the room with those executives debating buy versus build, and specifically around questions related to GRC, how do you frame that conversation? And I'll say specifically, how do you make the case that the right path is often to buy something and then build on top of it?
That's a great question. I think it actually works really nicely with what Grace just said. And I really love hearing that. And I think the benefit comes really from when you're able to meet at the intersection between innovation and business value generation, right? And I think it's you take what you're trying to do as a business process, the value you're trying to achieve and deliver, and you then take the technology that may or may not exactly do what you're trying to achieve. Taking the tasks, taking the things that free up your individuals, free up their time and resources that they can then focus on other critical work that really helps the business move the needle. I think that's where the conversation really is going and has been for the last little bit, which is, look, we've all been very excited about AI. I don't know a single person who really hasn't been excited. But now we're starting to get to a point where that excitement, of course, comes with a heavy cost of AI utilization. And we're starting to look at everything that we do and how do we measure that value? How do we measure the actual outcome, the tangible item that we have? And is that really providing us the level of value that we're looking for? And I think that's really the conversation that we start to have. It's no longer about, that's great, everybody go do AI, use AI, think AI, breathe AI. It's more of, let's make sure whatever it is we're trying to do has longevity, make sure that it's surgical in the approach so that we're not being wasteful. But then also we're using AI to really augment, our weaknesses and help us accelerate achieving that end goal that we're trying to achieve, and which is always, I think, for us, generating that value for the business.
Great comments, Pam. And let me stay with you just to follow up on a couple of things that you said. Once you've made that case, how do you actually decide? What are the factors that determine what are the pieces that you build and what are the pieces that you buy?
That's a great question. I think that's going to differ between anyone you speak with. I think it has a lot to do with that, the culture of the business and what you're doing from a leadership perspective. I think that aside, my motto has always been build the thing that you're great at and it's aligned to your business and business values, right? And you'll hear that a lot from me. That business value is very critical. If you're in let's say travel, you don't want to build a ton of cybersecurity applications or compliance applications. But to Grace's point, there are things that you want to do that allows you to accelerate what you're doing and really vastly improve what you're doing, but you don't want to become a GRC vendor. You don't want to become a cybersecurity vendor, right? That's not our business. And so anytime I think typically you look at a buy versus build, there's that fundamental piece. But then there's also the longevity piece, the life cycle around it. Do we really need to build or buy, right? And for whatever reason you land on a build, you have to understand the mechanics that go behind that decision. you have to understand the resources and the decision and the cost that's going to take for you to maintain that application, maintain the longevity of it, and it has to be supported, right? You need people to support and keeping the lights on, and you need people that are going to be able to evolve that product or that solution for you. Because again, it's not a point in time where you go and say, I'm going to build this, and all of a sudden everything stops in the world. There's no further requirements, there's no further enhancements. And so now you have committed yourself into having to maintain, evolve, enhance this piece of solution where there is probably an army of people somewhere dedicated to just doing that.
Thanks, Payam. And Grace, let me pose a similar question to you then. And again, here I think is where your dual vantage point really shines. Between your internal role on the one hand and your advisory practice, how do you advise teams on how to draw that line, what to buy, what to build?
When you're making a decision on what you're going to build versus buy, that longevity that Pam was talking about, that's important. Where a lot of times we're looking at things that are around regulatory compliance and changes. And while we will stay abreast of that, if you're building it versus buying it, you're going to need to know how to factor that in. How do you govern that? How do you constantly, how are you orchestrating so that you're adapting to that and continually enhancing it? How are you keeping abreast of the new and greatest things that the vendor community is doing in the GRC world? So it may not be just the intelligence, it may be the functionality. And how do you stay abreast of that? That's why I like the idea of working with our vendor community for some base of the product, because they're aware of the things that from an orchestration perspective or a function perspective are important to us as consumers of the GRC products. On the other hand, there are things from our strategy, from my corporate strategy, from my business strategy, from my team strategy that are important to me that my vendors may not know. And so those are the types of things that we're looking to build. How do I support my strategy? How do I support my team? How do I support the day-to-day things that we're doing that can be done with less human interaction, with reducing some of the human error?
Thank you, Payam and Grace. Really appreciate your perspective today. Across the GRC teams we work with, we're seeing exactly that same shift that Grace and Payam described. The question is no longer build versus buy. It's what do you build, what do you buy, and increasingly what do you build on top of what you buy. Our perspective, honed from many conversations, is that platforms should handle the shared high-stakes foundation, the evidence layer, auditability, compliance logic, integrations, governance, so that teams can focus their engineering effort and their limited resources on the workflows, automations, and AI capabilities that actually differentiate their business. That's where we believe the future is headed. Not choosing between building and buying, but rather combining both in the right places. If you want a framework for thinking through where that line should sit for your organization, we've put together a decision guide. You'll find it on our website. Thank you for watching, and with that, back to Marl.
Thank you, Aidan. I know a lot of teams need the speed and the scale of AI-driven systems, but do lack the internal expertise to build the tools themselves. So before we move on, I would love to know what this looks like inside of your organization. Here are the instructions for how to participate in our polls. All you need to do is open up the chat, respond with the number of the answer that you want to vote for, and push send. That's it. It'll automatically be calculated into what we see on the screen. So to vote, just send a 1, 2, 3, or 4. All right, here we go. Poll number 1. When evaluating a new AI capability for your GRC program, do you typically build it internally, buy purpose-built technology, combine the internal capabilities with the purpose-built tools, or are you still figuring it out, which is a perfectly acceptable answer? I guarantee a lot of your peers are going to find themselves there. All right, pretty clear out the gate on a combined strategy. I love to see it. Yep, so I'm still figuring this out. Wow, the lightest one is built internally. That is actually really interesting. I might do a post on that. Okay, keep those answers in the back of your mind because the next session is aimed directly at one of the reasons that that decision matters, right? Do you build it? Do you buy it? Or do you buy part of it and then build on top of that? Building an AI interface today is relatively easy thanks to vibe coding. but one that understands your controls, your evidence, your policies, your risk context, and finally what to do with all of that information with high fidelity at scale is a completely different proposition. Which brings us to our next session. And yes, we put verses in the title deliberately. General purpose built LLMs are extraordinary. I use them, you use them, your employees are definitely using them, whether or not your AI policy says that they can. But there's a difference between a model being able to answer a GRC question and an AI system that actually understands your GRC environment well enough to operate it on your behalf, right? So context matters, data matters, permissions matter, auditability matters, and increasingly, the ability to actually do something with all of that information matters. So rather than me boring you to death, we have Mateo Bravo, a customer success manager here at Anecdotes, to explain it to you better. So without further ado, this is the one you've been waiting for. It's Claude versus Chat GRC.
I'm Mateo Bravo, one of the CSMs here at Anecdotes. And for the next 15 minutes, we're having a conversation I've been wanting to have for a while. Vertical versus horizontal AI and GRC. Full disclosure up front, I'm a heavy Claude user. I use it every day. So this isn't a takedown. It's about what happens when AI already knows your world versus when you have to teach it. Horizontal AI is the most efficient hire that you might add to your team, but it initially lacks the context, processes, and tools that might make it the most intelligent and accurate. Vertical AI, however, shows up already trained on day one, out of the box. Your team also won't be the ones sinking time and resources into maintaining it. To discuss the considerations for implementing both types of AI tooling, I've got two people who run serious compliance programs and use both kinds of AI daily. Chad Fryer, head of GRCP at Docker, and Pierre-Paul Furland, the GRC senior manager and AI builder at Coveo. Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you both for joining us today. Chad, let's kick things off with you. So, Chad, you work with both the GRC analysts and GRC engineers. When it comes to your team, do you have any preference for vertical or horizontal AI?
To be honest, it's kind of a clear split. And it took me a while to admit that, if I'm being honest. I've built out a pretty extensive horizontal ecosystem at Docker. Claude connected to Notion, Claude connected to Slack, Google Drive, our risk register, skill files that encode how our program actually thinks. My GRC engineers and we get enormous value out of that because it's our opinions that are coded into the tools themselves. My analysts, however, they don't need any of that. Honestly, working in a vertical system is completely fine for them. They just need to be able to have a conversational AI chat that is enabling them to do what they need. The system, it already knows what the controls are, it knows what the evidence looks like, the frameworks, exactly how they map to each other. Those opinions are already coded into the tool, and that's realistically all they need. So I frame it internally it's capability versus opinion. The vertical tools ship with the opinions baked in. That's exactly what my team needs out of them. The horizontal tool ships with none of it. It's all based on us. We have to create all of it ourselves. And for our engineers, that is just insanely valuable.
All right. Chad, can you walk us through a moment where that speed mattered?
So it's most likely going to be, it's not really during audit season. It's when like sales leadership walks in with a new framework that our company's never touched. Usually there's either an entire market segment behind it, or the question's never, are we compliant? It's how far off we and what would it take? They need a level of effort with that answer, and they need it fast because there's a customer conversation going on. We're at a go, no-go decision waiting on it. Generally, in the past, that was extremely painful. Someone pulls a framework, they build a spreadsheet, they map out every requirement to our existing controls and evidence. Manually, it's like 2-week tasks. Sometimes by the time you finish, some of that information's already becoming stale. With Claude, it's like a day and a half entry because there's context that needs to be built in and a foundation to build on for Claude to be able to pull the correct answer. With Chat GRC, it's the same day. It's usually a couple hour delay in the conversation. Framework goes in, it maps against what we already have, and I can Slack sales leadership a couple hours later and say, here's what we covered today, here's the gap, here's roughly what closing it looks like. Part that I care about most as a program lead, it's going to be how speed changes how security and GRC are perceived. When the answer to can we pursue this market comes back in hours instead of weeks, GRC and security, we're no longer being the department of no. We're no longer slowing down deals. Instead, we become a team that actually enables sales. And once we get sales on our side, everything else kind of falls in place for us. So that perception shift is worth the tool cost itself.
Thank you so much, Chad. Over to you, Pierre Paul. So you're a builder. You've got a heavily customized, interconnected system of AI tools in Coveo. How does vertical AI fit into a program as complex as yours?
I would say it's able to fill in the gaps nicely. So we use a commercial GRC platform, Anecdotes, not to name it. But here's a spoiler. Anecdotes is not perfect. No tool is perfect, right? And so the vertical GRC is able to get those little things that we wouldn't be able to get out of the tool. So it's a perfect complement. On top of that, the vertical AI that we benefit from has the built-in connectivity that we need since Anecdotes connects to everything. We're able to interrogate the evidence much more efficiently. Could we do it in theory with a bunch of MCP servers, with a bunch of connections, with scripts? Yes, but it's tough to manage. Whereas on the vertical side, it's all coming right out of the box. And as Chad mentioned previously, it's opinionated. And for an analyst, it doesn't have to worry about that part of the game. It doesn't have to worry as much as prompt engineering or intent engineering or whatever. It just works for the intent that you have right out of the box, connects to the systems, connects to the right evidence, needs less context, and therefore is a bit faster.
All right. And how have you used both types of AI tooling for, something like audit prep and execution?
Oh, well, that's actually an exciting one, because and that's an argument for having a great vertical AI platform, right? Because so not to turn this into an anecdotes infomercial, but we have our auditors audit system connected directly to anecdotes. Therefore, everything our analysts see in a given framework, whether we're doing SOC 2, whether we're doing ISO 42001, it's the same evidence that gets sent by APIs. And so if tomorrow, like Chad has a use case, the sales team wants a new framework, then we can import that frameworks through our vertical GRC platform. Ask the chat, oh, can you do the mapping for me, please? Can you map the evidence? Oh, we don't need to regenerate the evidence. We don't need to take another screenshot because the evidence is already there. And it gets sent directly. It could be sent in real time to the auditor. Oh, and by the way, it also gets sent to the trust center. So there's economies of scale, there's economies of accuracy, and we can have a clear view and not worry about updating versions and like working if we were using different spreadsheet. Oh, you wanna AI UC1? Oh, it's the spreadsheet that I sent you by email. No, that's not how it works. And even if you use something like a Claude and you have a project, well, the project have files, they Word files on your computer and your Google Drive, it gets confusing real fast. Whereas if you have a vertical platform, then you have more consolidated. That's not to say the horizontal part is useless. It's a great DIY way. It's a great way to work if you have nothing.
All right. Well, thank you, Pierre Paul. All right, gents, we're moving on to some rapid fire questions before our next segment here. So let's close out the QA with some quick ones. So where does horizontal AI still win for you?
What you didn't ask, though, is where horizontal AI is the biggest loss for us, and that is cost. Not every enterprise has an Oprah that's sitting there and she's throwing unlimited credits to everybody. Employees, you get tokens, you get tokens. For the GRC team, there are some GRC teams that have a limit, and utilizing something like Chat GRC is going to remove a potential heavy spend for that GRC team and allow them to shift that AI spend elsewhere. So it comes with a cost, man. It's great, but it comes with a cost.
There's such a thing as UI fatigue. So we have to work where people work. So the GRC part is great for your team, your GRC team, your GRC operations, your risk operations. But people will not necessarily log into that platform. So this is why you need an MCP server, because that way, with your horizontal AI, you can bring the content from your GRC platform elsewhere.
All right. I think that's all pretty valid. And what have you gentlemen tried with AI that you've had to roll back?
We created something called wristwatch. We rolled it out for a while. It was doing fantastic. However, we had to roll it back because when you really get into it, you realize there was a lot more work that needed to be done, and a human needed to be the one that's actually providing all that enrichment. We also rolled it back because it decided to interject itself into every single Slack conversation, whether or not it was invited. So everybody on Slack was screaming, "You have to turn this off."
I got pretty much the same problem with an agent that would go into Slack and spam people. That's the reason why we pulled off one of the bots that I had built.
All right, well, thank you so much, gents. That's all the time we have for Q&A. We're going to be moving over to a little demonstration here now. Now, before we get into any testing, results, or comparison of AI tools, here's a scenario of what we're working with. We took two AI tools and gave them the same GRC questions. On one side, Claude, and to be clear, we didn't hobble it, so we used the most capable setup as provided out of the box. The Fable model, maximum effort, sub-agents running in parallel. We pointed it at what a newly hired GRC analyst may realistically have. So a Google Drive with folders of evidence, screenshots, policies, and risk and compliance information tracked on spreadsheets. Dozens of artifacts organized in a simple yet effective folder structure. On the other side, ChatGRC, working off the same underlying information, but as structured and interconnected data inside a clean test instance of anecdotes, no additional customization, every feature structured as shipped. Every answer you're about to see was checked by hand. A team of GRC professionals verified the inputs, outputs, test cases, and testing conditions. So this isn't AI grading AI. Now, first use case, terminated employee access reviews. This is one that most GRC practitioners have lived through. User access monitoring and employee offboarding. The question is, of our recently terminated employees, how many still have active accounts across our identity providers, Jump Cloud, OneLogin, or Entra ID? That's the exact question an auditor might ask, and the kind of thing that could keep a CISO up at night. Same prompt, both tools. Now, both tools produce an in-depth analysis, but at a high level, let's take a look at the disparity between outputs. The correct answer is 5. 5 terminated people are still active across all 3 systems, verified by hand against the actual data. ChatGRC got it right, 5, named correctly. Now, Claude said 8. It erroneously flagged 3 additional inactive users. The horizontal AI assumed that these 3 users were still active because they had MFA configurations captured in a screenshot. That's the real cost. These 3 false positives introduce doubt and the need for further verification. If your new analyst trusts the 8, they potentially waste anywhere from an hour to a full day validating this response or pursuing corrective action that was unneeded in the first place. If they had trusted a lower number, they'd have missed a real risk and potentially a systemic failure. Either way, someone has to go verify by hand. ChatGRC knows better. Now, moving on to the second use case, ISO 27001 password policy report. So in this second use case, relevant to any org that puts an emphasis on continuous control monitoring, maybe you're gearing up to pursue a FedRAMP 20X certification. We asked both tools to produce a control operating effectiveness report for secure authentication as defined in ISO 27001. From the same password policy evidence, same prompt goes into both. Let's see what we get. Both outputs look great, professional, formatted, confident. On the screen, they're almost indistinguishable. But when a GRC professional assessed the outputs on factual fidelity, traceability, testing, logic, and accuracy, they identified several concerning deviations in the Claude output. ChatGRC consolidated control metadata, evidence metadata, and even more granular control effectiveness metrics extracted from comparing the intended design of the control to whether or not the evidence collected supports that design and implementation of the control. Again, no additional customization, all produced with functionalities as shipped. Now, Claude wrote the more polished-looking report, but called the password policy approved and in effect when it's actually still in draft pending sign-off. It recommended mapping the evidence to controls it was already mapped to. It even described an API it never actually looked at. None of that is stupidity. It's a highly capable tool, but filling in gaps confidently without the necessary additional context to paint a full picture. Completeness and accuracy are very important for auditors and a critical part of the assessment. Claude hallucinated and used the file creation date as the evidence collection date. It also inferred and essentially fabricated the API call used to produce this data. Another example is Claude setting false expectations for jump cloud password configuration as opposed to what is actually defined in internal policy. Even though testing criteria exists in the data provided, Claude overlooked that an expiration routine of 90 days is more restrictive and better to have than a password that doesn't expire. Now, a report that is wrong but looks right is worse than no report, because an inexperienced individual or somebody without the right context may not take the time to validate the results. That traceability, the rule, the result, timestamp, is exactly what ChatGRC gives you out of the box, and exactly what you're left to rebuild by hand otherwise. So, 2 use cases, same story. The model isn't the differentiator. We gave Claude the best. The differentiator is the underlying data and context driving the analysis. Point a generic tool at a pile of screenshots and it behaves like a brilliant intern on day 1. Fast, confident, and occasionally confidently wrong. A purpose-built GRC tool understands the structure. So the answer you get is the answer you can actually put in front of an auditor. Every AI answer carries some sort of verification debt. The question is whether you pay it or the tool does. Thank you so much for joining me for this discussion and this demo, everyone. Now back to you, Meryl.
And I think the distinction on that verification tax becomes even more important when we stop asking AI just to tell us things and start asking it to actually do the things, right? That's probably the part of AI and GRC that interests me the most, because an agent isn't valuable just because it can make a prettier summary of something I already knew, right? The promise is taking that enormous volume of repetitive rules-based work that humans are currently wasting their cycles doing, collect this, compare that, check this condition, chase this person, create this ticket, escalate this exception, right? And letting the machines handle that slog at scale. So we're not seeking to replace human judgment, and we're certainly not replacing accountability, and we're definitely not trying to turn compliance into a black box exercise where we have no idea how we got there. The point is to reserve that human judgment for the things that actually warrant it, right? So if your FTE must spend their expensive hour on that investigation, it had better be damn well worth their time to do so. Kathleen Oliveira from our sales engineering team lives right at that intersection, and she's bringing us an actual case study with customer Brittany Davis, the compliance program manager at 360 Insights, on moving from those traditional workflows towards more agentic operations. So here's from workflows to agents, real stories from the front lines. Please take it away, Kathleen and Brittany.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kathleen Oliveira, Solution Engineer at Anecdotes. Today, we're talking about one of the biggest shifts happening in GRC, the evolution from workflows to agents. So to help us explore what that shift looks like in practice, I'm joined by Brittany Davis, Compliance Program Manager at 360 Insights Canada. Brittany has firsthand experience using AI and automation to scale GRC programs while keeping people at the center of decision-making. In this conversation, we'll discuss where traditional workflows fall short, where agents can make the biggest impact, and what organizations need to get right before bringing agentic AI into their GRC programs. So, Brittany, let's start with your current GRC processes. Where do you see the greatest opportunity for automation in your current processes? Which manual tasks consume the most time today? And where could agents have the biggest impact in helping teams get compliance work done?
When it comes to workflows and agents, there is kind of the delineation and understanding that a workflow is do a thing, manual person steps in, do a thing, manual person steps in, and there's so much manual touch. I don't know about everyone else's GRC or security department, but I know that my responsibilities and what our org needs, especially given AI, that landscape and the horizon continues to expand. So things like workflows were nice maybe 5 or 6 years ago when we didn't have to consider the same level of risk, the same level of security operations or threat even when using stuff like that. So something like an agent being able to cut down on more manual tasks, such as kind of collecting information, making that easier for me, allows me to be more strategic in my approach to GRC because I don't have to spend the time constantly going through and approve next step to every part of the workflow. I can go in and see what my agent has collated for me, either in a dashboard or have it sent manually even to my email if I don't even want to sign into the tool, where I can kind of see what the tool has kind of put together for me. At that point, I can poke holes in it, right? So it's put it together for me in a way that I can now understand better what the landscape is, rather than spending my whole morning approving JIRA tickets with the correct workflow to then move to the next thing to ensure. I have agents that even review the JIRA tickets now at this point for me to say what's missing or what our engineering teams might need to supplicate to ensure that our auditor doesn't have a problem. So things like that can then feed into the narratives that Anecdotes builds overall, because it does connect to Atlassian. So it makes those types of things really easy, and I can easily write from the tool as well. So creating runbooks that can run automatically based on characteristics that I look for as a GRC professional in even the workflows that teams are using currently is how I can be much more of a bigger team, even though I might only be a team of a couple people.
That's a great perspective. I especially like your point that the goal isn't to remove people from the process, but to free them from repetitive work so they can focus on higher value decisions. That naturally brings us to another important question. For an agent to be genuinely useful in GRC, it also has to be reliable. What gives you confidence in an agent's output? And what context, data, and transparency does it need in order to support sound decisions?
Being able to understand why it came to the conclusion, not relying on the conclusion it made. So that kind of delineation between whether or not decision making is automated, which is usually a no-go in the space of GRC, right? You want an individual and a professional to be the one involved. But if I don't understand how an agent works or how it's thinking, getting to that regression conclusion through whatever tensor wave math layers it's using, then I'm not going to trust it because I don't know how it's kind of inferring what it's coming to that conclusion of. So again, data or it didn't happen in the structure. And of course, like data is messy. So being able to understand that the agent is relying on, consistent data before it gets to the stage of actually being used in that trustworthy space is really what's important.
I think that's such an important distinction. It's not about trusting the answer blindly. It's about understanding how the agent reached its recommendation. And that leads nicely into governance. When you hear the term agentic GRC, what comes to mind? What should organizations get right in their governance foundation before introducing agents into their environment?
I mean, when it comes to that, Kathleen, it's messy governance that makes it pretty evident, right? Like I think most GRC professionals, and yes, this is broad brush speaking, run the other direction from AI agents because they know their asset inventory isn't complete. Their controls aren't written well. Their control implementation isn't done correctly. Is their risk register? When was the last time that was earnestly updated, right? So when it comes to messy governance, those problems exist regardless to whether or not you put an agent in your environment. And starting at that baseline to understand these agents don't create net new, they just pull in to help you develop what that net new is. So understanding that their job is to not make a decision for you or to infer or attempt to infer on things. Because if you just hook in an agent to any environment that you have, any vendor that you have or you're potentially using, and you don't take a look at what the initial stages of that trust layer that we talked about before, how it's built, what it's doing, it's just going to amplify all of those problems. So if you don't have good data classification, it's just going to show you very quickly and expeditiously that you do not have good data classification, and that's a larger problem than you might realize, which, sometimes can help target work that you might need to do in GRC or work that you might need to do as kind of the enterprise level to ensure your entire organization meets those things. But without considering that first layer of what your agent is building off of, it's just going to amplify that noise. So whether or not that's helping you collate the information or if it's making a bad problem worse, agents are very good at both.
I completely agree that agents can only amplify the foundation they're built on. If the underlying data and processes aren't in good shape, AI will simply magnify those problems. One last question. You've described agents as having two important roles: researching the context around potential issues, and then helping drive the appropriate downstream actions. Can you walk us through why that research phase matters and how it helps teams determine whether an issue requires remediation, escalation, or just more investigation?
When it comes to research for AI agentic and just kind of leveraging AI tools in a actual agent workflow versus a regular manual workflow, I mean, you can see very clearly the steps where I would have to be potentially spending hours looking at data across it, just even that research or that initial, it happened here, or even targeting where something might happen, right? Like, especially in GRC or kind of security response, sometimes you don't know what the issue might be or what that gap initially is. And that fact-finding mission is more vital than it might be during an audit period where you're discussing things and things kind of take a little bit longer. So being able to target or pinpoint more quickly what an issue might be is really important. And it is something that across a messy tech stack, an agent can pull in to, again, give me that information to then provide the action of what are we doing? Is it a remediation? Is it an action right away? Or am I pulling the bell alarms and everyone's getting woken up with pager duty? So it kind of helps give that information to whether or not it requires an immediate, it requires a not, because there are a lot of false positives that you get from monitoring tools by and large. So being able to sift through the noise of your own organization, the noise of your own data, and then on top of it, the noise of those monitoring tools and what they might be reporting themselves. Like, I have no control over what other vendors choose to notify me of in the systems we buy. We just kind of try to fit it, right? And sometimes that doesn't fit. Sometimes part of the answer fits and it has to be built with other things to give you that full picture. So that's where the research component for agentic models specifically is very helpful for people in GRC who are trying to figure out what a gap is and what that true issue is. And sometimes it's as simple as someone forgot to configure something correctly, or it could be an entire process or server is down, and being able to delineate between that. Important to do that faster rather than slower.
Thanks so much, Brittany. I think one thing really stands out from everything you shared. Agents aren't about replacing people or replacing workflows. They're about eliminating the manual research that slows GRC teams down so people can spend more time making decisions instead of gathering information. Let's make that a little more concrete with an example. Imagine a quarterly risk review that must be done by an analyst and reviewed by the GRC team. This is critical for staying proactive, identifying when controls are failing. For example, maybe a system security configuration changed at scale, or the goalpost moved because a new framework requirement was added. Maybe something drifted in a system where access to sensitive data is managed. You want to identify this before an auditor does and proactively manage the risk. And a quarterly visibility report can help with this. You don't necessarily need AI to identify that drift, although it can be helpful. A lot of GRC work is deterministic, it's binary. The rule either passes or fails. The configuration is either aligned or it's not. And where AI becomes powerful is correlating the context across various libraries, including your risk register, checking for related findings and controls, and everything that happens downstream, because that's where GRC teams lose time. Someone has to understand what changed in the risk posture. Someone has to check whether this has happened before. Someone has to see whether related controls are also failing, look for open findings and prior exceptions, compensating controls, ownership information, and of course, remediation history. And then someone has to turn all of that into a clear next step. That is where an agent can help. Instead of asking an analyst to spend hours collecting that information, the agent researches issues across your GRC environment. It connects the dots for robust risk reporting, identifies related risks, finds previous findings, checks for active exceptions, understands ownership, and drafts a recommendation for a remediation plan. And this is just one example of how an Anecdotes agent can help enhance risk visibility for better decision making and free up your team's time for actually addressing risk. Again, the agent is not operating in a silo, but also with human engagement. So for instance, to review this quarterly report, by the time an analyst gets involved, they're reviewing a complete picture instead of starting from scratch. The analyst can then route that issue to the right owner with the right context before the issue becomes a finding or an incident or another fire drill at audit time. And once that context has been assembled, the workflow doesn't disappear. It continues. The report is submitted, issues are routed to the right owners, remediation begins, approvals happen when they're needed, and people remain accountable for the final decision. That's the real power of AI in GRC. It doesn't replace judgment or accountability, and it doesn't turn compliance into a black box. It takes care of the work that doesn't require human judgment, so your experts can focus on the work that does. It's doing the legwork of correlating data, surfacing patterns, reducing manual searching and copy pasting, reconciliation, and follow-up work that consumes so much of a GRC team's week. And most importantly, it's showing people where human action needs to happen. And that's really the evolution from workflows to agents. Workflows are still incredibly valuable. They provide structure, consistency, and governance. Agents make those workflows smarter by doing the research, gathering the context, and reducing the manual effort that has always slowed GRC teams down. But as Brittany pointed out, none of that works without the right foundation. Agents are only as good as the data they're built on. And if they're operating on disconnected spreadsheets and stale evidence and incomplete information, they'll simply automate bad decisions faster. But when they're grounded in structured, source-connected, audit-ready data, they become something incredibly valuable, a trusted partner that helps GRC teams move faster without sacrificing control. And that's the future we're building toward, not replacing GRC professionals, but giving them the context they need to focus on judgment instead of busy work. Thanks again, Brittany, for sharing your experience and perspective. Thank you all for joining us. Back to you, Meryl.
Wow, I bet those people I called out for having 17 spreadsheets earlier are a little mad right now. But trust in agentic outputs is huge, right? So before we move on, I want to test something. I think we can all agree that agents can be incredibly useful, but where does your trust in them stop? So I want to know, what is the most autonomous action you would trust a GRC AI agent to take on your behalf today? Is it to gather and organize evidence? Is it to evaluate evidence against a defined policy? Is it to trigger remediation or workflow actions based on that? Or is it to make and actually execute a risk or compliance-based decision on your behalf? I'm excited for this one. Wow, almost out of the gate. Evaluate evidence against a defined policy was a very clear yes. Some folks are a little more risk averse, a little more conservative, but there are quite a few who would let it at least trigger a remediation or workflow action, which is very telling. But the clear majority. Looks like we're only going to maximum at this point in time let them evaluate evidence against predefined baselines. And I think this is so much more enlightening than simply asking whether or not we trust AI, right? Trust isn't binary. You might trust an agent to collect 10,000 pieces of evidence without supervision, but still want a human being making the final risk decision. That's not resistance to AI. That's just good architecture. And architecture becomes particularly important when regulation starts demanding that we move from periodic evidence exercises towards something much more continuous and machine readable, which unironically brings us very neatly into FedRAMP. So if you work anywhere near the federal compliance space, you've probably heard the term FedRAMP 20X approximately 9,000 times in recent meetings. But beneath the acronym soup is actually a much bigger shift I think matters everywhere, not just inside federal programs, right? We're talking about a model that is increasingly oriented around automation, machine readable information, continuous evidence, and proving that controls actually operate in real time, not simply proving that they existed at one point in time. And Anecdotes has had a really interesting seat for this one because we haven't just been talking about FedRAMP 20X. No. We've had a ton of fun going through it, and we've been using our own tool to help us get there. So we are literally eating the same food that we are feeding you. So we brought together for this one the practitioner side and the assessor side of things. Here up next, we've got Jake Bernardis, Security Advisor, joined by Matt Hungate, Managing Principal at Shellman, to talk about what this transition actually looks like in practice for both the operators and the auditors. So this is the road to FedRAMP 20X.
Welcome to this session today, FedRAMP 20X, or the F word as it's become affectionately known in my vocabulary and social channels. It refers to a program which I think is a bit of a mini revolution. I have Matt Hungate from Shellman and Mikhail Kipnis, one of the geniuses of my team, joining me today. And we're going to delve into the whole subject of FedRAMP 20X. It's a torrid child of the family in a way. It was kind of rejected from its first point when agencies said, no, we're not going to follow it. We are going to challenge it. And now it's almost come full circle into the limelight as being the darling of our industry. It looks like it might well take out CMMC and other standards and leave them in its wake. It's very much a space that excites a lot of us in this GRC and compliance world of ours. For many of us, FedRAMP was an untouchable standard, an absolute nightmare, if I'm being honest. You needed huge amounts of money, you needed sponsors, and for many, including myself, it was viewed as archaic, heavily reliant on binary controls and on a lot of documentation, and not future-proofed in any way, shape, or form. And that's where I wanted to launch this conversation. So, Matt, Mikhail, if you want to introduce yourself, then I will start firing away with my questions. So let's start with you, Matt. Who are you?
Hi, everyone. And yeah, thanks for having me, Jake and team. So my name is Matt Hungate, Managing Principal at Shellman. So I help oversee our federal practice, which includes FedRAMP. And I also had the pleasure of working with the Anecdotes team on their 20X journey. So yeah, happy to be here and talking shop about everything that's kind of going on in the FedRAMP world these days.
Thanks, Matt. And Mikhail.
Hi, Jake. Hi, Matt. Thank you very much for having me. I'm the InfoSec manager in your team and Jake's team at Anecdotes, and I'm responsible for everything to do with the security the implementation side of things, including FedRAMP 20X, which we're here to talk about.
Which is either his favorite or least favorite topic, depending on which day you ask him. So, Matt, starting again with you, I obviously am passionate and think that FedRAMP 20X is a revolution in the compliance industry. I think it's the start of a wave that leads to data-led, automation-driven compliance across all standards. But I'm not an auditor. So in your world, is this good? Is it more work or less work for you? Do you get greater levels of assurance versus lower levels of assurance? Is it harder to work with the clients? Do you need different staff to do it? Talk to me about the audit perspective on 20X.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you hit on it in your intro. I think one of the biggest challenges that not just CSPs dealt with the legacy Rev 5 version of FedRAMP is related to kind of the documentation burden, right? So that was also a burden on the 3PAO or auditor side, where there's massive amounts of documentation that we had to sift through in order to validate whether a control was in place, in addition to actually validating the security of that control, right? So I think when we look at the shift, what I'm most excited about is kind of the investment shift from the documentation piece into the engineering and automation piece. So that's I think one of the biggest fundamental differences we're seeing with 20X. And I think from an investment perspective, it's not necessarily going to be less money or time from the CSP side. It's going to be a difference on where you're going to be spending that. That's what we've been seeing from a lot of our clients. I'm sure you and your team experienced that as well, where FedRAMP is still not an easy button by any means. There's still a lot of work and time that needs to go into automation and pipeline capabilities. But the difference is you're actually getting value out of these assessments now, and that these validations, where previously there was a lot of investment spent into developing the documentation and maintaining it, which you just didn't get a whole lot of value out of, both from the CSP side and the auditor side.
We've talked about how 20X has changed the industry. We've talked about how it's changing intentionally the auditor's approach and the type of people that you need. We've talked about the degree of assurance it gives. Let's talk about the future. Now, it seems, at least, it's been publicly stated that Rev 5 will be sunsetted in the very near future. There's definitely talk about the impact of FedRAMP 20X on CMMC, ISO, and other standards. What's your take on that? What's the timelines and how do you think it's going to play for those already in the FedRAMP space?
The timeline that FedRAMP has defined as of today, right, it's June 11th, 2027. That is when they're going to be basically cutting off all new FedRAMP certifications for Rev 5. So unless you're already in active conversations with an agency that has said they're going to be sponsoring you, it probably makes sense to start building towards 20X, right? So that is kind of the message that FedRAMP and Pete has made very clear.
Mikhail, let's move on to you. So you wrote a LinkedIn post that semi-supported and semi-slated me as an individual. I gave you a challenge and said, work out a way to get us to FedRAMP, and not very much timeline and not very much information. Anecdotes obviously went through a journey from having never touched federal compliance to being authorized as moderate or Class C, as it's now called in 20X lingo, as part of that phase 2 pilot program. So talk about the journey from the moment you've never seen federal compliance before and going from nothing to this point. Talk about the lessons that you learned, the speed bumps along the way, and whatever else you want to throw in.
As you said, you actually told me about a half a year ago, 6 months or 8 months. Hey, listen, there's a new program called 20X. It's FedRAMP, and we're going to do it. And I don't come from the GRC space. I've been at Anecdotes for a couple of years. That's the first time at Anecdotes that I meet the field of the documentation side of things. I'm always the implementation side of things, and always the engineer, always the solution builder. So 20X, in my view, was a perfect fit for me, for my capabilities. Problem was, it was a pilot, and it was ever changing. And the struggle that I had as an individual, or call it a GRC engineer, me as a company, as a security practitioner, was first understand what exactly FedRAMP wants. And because their description and their requirements were vague on purpose, because it was a pilot phase and it was shaping the program itself to bring it to the 21st century.
I want to double click on a couple of things that you said. One is 6 months, which traditionally a timeframe for FedRAMP, Matt, it's like 18 to 24 months?
So the timeline in the legacy FedRAMP process was extremely variable. It would not have been unheard of to reach kind of the upper end of 24 months. So it's a much quicker time to market, and I think that's a huge benefit that I think we're also seeing as well.
So, Mikhail, you did it a quarter of the time and you have no GRC background, and that draws me to a point. Pete Waterman, who runs FedRAMP 20X, for those who don't know, has given this statement several times in multiple places where he said compliance is an engineering problem. You start by saying, I'm an engineer. That was the first point that you made, and it's a key point of your thesis, and I think it's an interesting point. I want to ask you one final question. When we interacted with FedRAMP, it felt different. You've obviously been involved in ISO and SOC and other programs and projects too. But this felt like a different audit process. It felt almost like a software development relationship where we showed them things and they said, well, I like the direction, I like the approach, but show us how you do that, or show us what the results and outcomes of that look like, and go and rework that for us in this way. It felt like an iterative thing where you're actually building compliance together rather than being tested on your score amongst or against a common criteria set. Is that the kind of feeling you got too? Or was I alone in that?
That's exactly what it was. I had a peer in my journey. The peer was the assessor, not the auditor. So the assessor, their role has changed. They can help us. They can guide us. They can get their own experience with all other CSPs that they go through this journey with, and get me their insights from past lessons learned from other people and other teams that did it.
It was fascinating to watch actually how you went through this, because I said from afar, from someone who comes from both a technical and a compliance background, at this point seeing how you took it on from a purely kind of software development iterative approach was really interesting and really effective. I think to try and kind of wrap this conversation, there's a couple of lessons learned here. Like I said, Anecdotes went from 0 to hero in 6 months, to Class C or moderate authorization, which in itself is astounding. I don't think that anyone has done it on such a small amount of resources or time frame as we did, and I'd be confident that no one can argue against that statement. I think there's two main reasons for that. I think number one is using Shellman, not to flatter them, but the team and Avni have been quite forward thinking and gone hard on 20x from day one, putting the people and the approaches in place to support and enable companies to go through these pilots. In fact, I think they did most of the pilots. And then on our side, number two, Mikhail's approaching this as an engineering problem and finding technical solutions rather than trying to solve a requirement, trying to solve problems that underpin the requirement one by one. We built actual solutions that were foundations that you can build upon. They're scalable, they're long-lasting, and they don't need reviewing on a cadence of 6 to 12 months as the audit comes. So for me, we go back to where we started. 20x is a revolution because it takes the compliance world from archaic history, documentation, and binary controls to pipelines, AI, and real-time JSON files that show actual compliance posture here and now. It's amazing that federal compliance was the first domain that went there. And I think this is the start, the beginning of a massive revolution. So thank you, Matt, for your thoughts. Thank you, Mikhail, for your thoughts, and also for the hellish 6 months that I put you through. I hope this is really interesting for those that are engaged and have listened. If you want to learn more about our journey, about Shellman's offerings, about FedRAMP, or about anything else related to 20x, about the challenges that we face or that you might face too, the joys, the tears that were shared, then please reach out to any of us directly via all known channels. But otherwise, thank you very much for listening.
What I love most about that conversation is FedRAMP 20x is ostensibly a federal compliance story, but underneath it is really the same problem we've been discussing all day, right? How do we stop managing modern risk and dynamic systems with point-in-time artifacts? Which brings us perhaps to one of the greatest offenders of the day, third-party risk management. Yes, I said it, TPRM, where PDFs go to breed. You all know this story. We send our vendors enormous questionnaires. They send enormous questionnaires back. Everyone answers the same questions for the 400th time. Someone maybe creates a risk rating, and then less than 6 months later, when the vendor's environment has inevitably changed, our big, beautiful risk assessment is now a deprecated artifact. So we agreed there had to be a better way. So our co-founder and chief product officer, Roy Amior, and his team looked at that process and apparently chose violence for their session, because the title of our final session is not, here's how we made TPRM marginally less annoying, by the way. It's PS, we fixed TPRM. I added the parentheses, you're welcome, which is a hell of a claim, I know, but let's see if we can make a believer out of you. So Roy, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone, and welcome. I'm Roy Amior, co-founder and CPO at Anecdotes, and I'm joined today by Jamin, Global CISO at Apex FinTech Solution. Thank you so much for being here. Over the past few years, GRC has changed a lot, but one challenge keeps coming up: third-party risk management. If you look at how most organizations actually manage TPRM today, it's still largely the same process it's been for years, and everyone is frustrated. So today, we'll talk about why the process has become so difficult, what pain points are holding teams back, and how we believe AI can fundamentally change the way TPRM gets done without taking humans out of the decision-making process. And for the first time, we'll also give you a sneak peek at our upcoming agentic TPRM solution and how we're rethinking the entire experience. Jamin, let's start with your perspective. From what you've seen, what are the biggest pain points organizations face with vendor assessments today?
Over the years, vendors and client relationship got more and more complex, as we know that, right? But the third-party risk management fundamentally hasn't changed much. We face the TPRM challenges as like most other companies do. It's not unique to us. For us, I would say there are three main points. There are three major pain points that we see. And I'll start with the first one, which is the manual work everywhere. From entire process, from start to finish, it's manual work. Whether it's classifying information for vendors or clients, collecting information, analyzing it, assessing it. For example, from questionnaires to reviewing responses, chasing vendors, going through SOC 2, DPA, and list goes on and on. All of them are pure manual work. And it's extremely time consuming. And it doesn't stop there, right? For a first assessment, great, you collected all this information. You do this all over again next time around. All manual work. The second point I would bring it up is not a single source of truth. Information lives across email threads, Slack messages, spreadsheet, vendors trust portal, GRC platform, wherever it landed. To make it harder, it actually makes it very hard to correlate this information and paint a risk picture. We all know that risk is not static. It constantly changes. But it makes it very hard when you have a sources data that you need for the paint the picture is scattered everywhere. So even if you nail the risk, nail the assessment very well, the problem is if you want to get it current, you recheck it. It's rechecking all the scatter sources again and again. The third pain point I would say is the trust gap in the responses. To tie it back to the first point, I would emphasize this, right? We all know risk doesn't stay still, but the assessment does. Most of the assessments are a snapshot, point in time, the accurate when you capture it, but the day after, it's no longer accurate. Every day after, it's no longer accurate. We also know whether it's vendor or clients, risk profiles changes constantly. But you won't find out till the next review. Maybe it's annual review. And if you say, well, let's fix this, we want to get more accurate, and then we start changing the cadence or frequency, right? And you want to change it to periodic reviews or validation. What that means, it's more manual work, compounding to the original problem. So honestly, I think a lot of this comes down to this is volume. It's not that TPRM team does not know what to do. They do, but it's so much manual work. It's so much repetitive work. That's where I think, this is where exactly what I think that AI can start alleviate some of the pain point for the TPRM team.
Thanks, Jamin. That's fascinating. And I couldn't put it better. And this aligns completely with what we hear from enterprise teams every day. And with these pain points and more in mind, we made the decision to solve the foundational problems in the Anecdotes way. First, we wanted to leverage our native automated data collection capabilities to address the vendor discovery challenge. Anecdotes plugins can connect to all kinds of relevant sources, from ERPs to identity providers, finance or procurement systems, all contain a portion of the vendors of a company. Dedicated AI agents then analyze the data and consolidate the different naming conventions of the vendor, presenting a unified view of the vendors detected. Once a vendor is detected, the agentic pipeline starts running immediately. Instead of a TPRM specialist that starts collecting and analyzing information, specialized agents are first classifying the vendor to the relevant tier, based on the classification criteria set by the company. According to the tier set by one agent, another one starts working. The assessment agents are now looking for relevant information, either internal or external, according to the relevant tier. Additional agents are specialized in analyzing different types of documents, such as PT, SOC 2, or AI policy, and then provide a risk assessment based on the controls defined by the GRC team. We're not asking you to change how you assess vendor risk. We simply feed your existing framework into autonomous agents, replacing manual, static questionnaires with continuous automated answers. But now you would ask, isn't it too risky to fully rely on agents for such a sensitive flow? And you're right. We'll let you decide when you need to stay in the loop and when to allow for autonomous agentic activity. For example, the agent has completed the assessment here. But because I set a rule requiring approval for critical tier vendors, it flagged an action item for me. From this screen, I can review the agent's work with full traceability and confidence scores and override any decision if needed. At any point, I can also jump in with ChatGRC, which shares the full context of the agent's activity. Once the initial assessment is complete, I can set my agentic TPRM pipelines to run on my terms, triggered by renewals, document expirations, or custom policies. The result? an ever-updating, highly scalable TPRM program driven by answers to my questions, not endless questionnaires. To summarize what we've covered today, legacy TPRM is broken by 3 core challenges: heavy manual overhead, scattered information, and lack of real trust due to static, point-in-time reviews. As you saw today, our agentic pipeline changes that completely. It automatically gathers evidence, maps it against your controls, continuously monitors vendor risk, and delivers actionable recommendations directly to your decision makers. Jamin, thank you for sharing your perspective and experience with us today. And if you'd like to learn more about our upcoming TPRM solution, we'd love to continue the conversation. Please feel free to reach out to us in the event chat or visit our website to get in touch. Thanks everyone for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the summit.
Well, you heard it here first. Roy said we fixed it. So now you can tell us what actually needs fixing. So for our last poll, poll number 3, what is the biggest failure point in your TPRM program today? Is it collecting vendor information, assessing that risk consistently, keeping the assessments current, or turning those findings into actionable remediation? Another clear winner right out of the gate. Are you all just answering number 2? I feel like you guys just favor number 2. Ooh, okay. Number 4 is pulling ahead, so turning findings into remediation. We don't actually know what to do with this information when we get it. And so to TPRM, I say, welcome to the engineering side of things where the rest of cyber has been for the last 5 years. Wow, very interesting. All right, well, that right there is why we wanted to ask you these questions today. Quite a variety of answers across the board. But we here at Anecdotes could sit around all day and tell each other all the opinions in the world about where GRC is going. But you're the people who actually have to operate these programs. You are living this pain every day. So what you're willing to automate, where you still need humans, what you're building yourself versus buying, and where the outputs still break, that is the reality that AI has to meet. If we're not solving for that, then what are we doing here? And on that note, we have somehow made it through 90 minutes of the GRC AI and Data Summit without anyone saying that Mythos is going to magically solve all their problems, so I consider that a win. But if there's one thing I hope you leave with today, it's this. AI is not the strategy. AI is forcing us to confront whether the systems we built underneath it are actually ready. Do we have trustworthy data? Do we know our running control health? Can machines understand our policies? Can our evidence be continuously evaluated against them? And do we know which decisions can and should be automated and which ones still deserve a human being or expert in the loop? Because the future of GRC isn't just going to be humans versus AI. It's going to be humans spending less of their time doing work a machine could have done and more of their time on that messy, complicated, abstract, big, beautiful decisions that we actually hired them to make in the first place. I think that's the utopia we can all pretty much agree on. But selfishly, please keep talking to us. Tell us where we're right, definitely tell us where we're wrong, and tell us what you're building, what you're struggling with, and what you're still doing manually that makes you want to throw your laptop at the wall, because those are the problems worth solving. With that, if anything you saw today makes you curious about what data and AI-powered GRC intelligence could look like inside your own program, please come talk to someone at Anecdotes. We would love to show you what we're building and, more importantly, hear about what you're building. Thank you again to all of our fabulous hosts and guests from today: Yair, Aiden, Grace, Payam, Mateo, Pierre, Paul, Chad, Kathleen, Brittany, Jake, Mikhail, Matt, Roy, and Jamin. And thank you to everybody behind the scenes who made today happen, including Brand Viva Media here in Denver. And thank you mostly to you for spending part of your day with us. I'm Meryl Vernon, and I'll leave you with this. The goal isn't to put AI into GRC because that's what everybody is doing. The goal is to finally build a version of GRC worthy of what AI makes possible. We'll see you out there doing it. Have a great day.